It's great to be here. It's great to see you here, and it's wonderful to be with people online all over the world. Let's keep the internet free. Let's make sure there is equal access for all. Let's close the digital divide so that everyone can communicate with each other together. Well, this is about City 90 for me as we travel around the country on our Breaking the Sound Barrier tour, celebrating media, independent, public access TV, community radio, Pacifica Radio, public radio stations, PBS stations, putting the public back in public television and radio. It's absolutely critical we bring together all the independent media in this time of war. Independent media is the hope. We began in Cape Cod on Labor Day, and I want to give a shout out to all my colleagues at Democracy Now! Who are here because this is a group endeavor, and they make it possible. But this is our 10th anniversary year at Democracy Now! We began on a few dozen community radio and Pacifica stations in 1996, expanded to television in September of 2001, public access TV. And when we go into a town on television, the radio station would ask to run us, and we would go on in radio, the television station, from public access TV and community stations to NPR stations to PBS stations, and now over 500 stations around the country are running Democracy Now!, as well as Free Speech TV, channel 9415 on Dish Network, and Link TV, channel 9410, which is also 375 on DirecTV. And we're video and audio podcasting, and our headlines are in Spanish. 100 stations are taking those around the world. We cannot do this alone. We have to build independent media state by state, country by country, because the corporate media has completely failed us. They have reached an all-time low in this country. But we began our Breaking the Sound Barrier tour in Cape Cod. Our second stop was Nantucket, an historic island. It's the place where Frederick Douglass gave his first address against slavery for abolition. He trembled when he spoke. His body shook because he was speaking from his own experience. He had been enslaved as a child and a teenager. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, handed to a man called a slave breaker. His name was Edward Covey. The other slave owners gave their troublesome slaves to Covey, and he would break them. But Frederick Douglass broke away, headed north, and changed the world. Edward Covey's property was called Mount Misery. Today, it is owned by Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense. It's his vacation home. He bought it in 2003 to be just down the road from his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. Mount Misery. Frederick Douglass, yes, changed the world as a publisher, as a writer, as a journalist who published the North Star. Today, I think they would describe him probably as an advocacy journalist, as he described the reality of slavery in this country. I believe he took a position against it. But I want to jump forward a couple decades to here in Memphis, to another remarkable pioneer maverick named Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching crusader who also had her own newspaper called Free Speech. She was Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks. Before she got the newspaper, she sat down on the Cleveland and Ohio railway car and was told to get off for a white man. She said no, was dragged off as she bit the conductor. She went to court, sued the railway. I think it was called the Cincinnati, I forgot the name of the railway car now. But she sued the railroad, and she won, though in the higher court, in the Supreme Court, that was ultimately overturned. Ida B. Wells then takes over this newspaper called Free Speech, and in 1892, she goes after, exposes those who lynched 3 Memphis businessmen, black businessmen, And because of her crusading journalism, her press was burned to the ground, and she was forced out of Memphis. Another remarkable crusading journalist. And then let's jump forward about 80 years or so, to a media critic, to Dr. Martin Luther King, who said these words April 30th, 1967 at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in the speech called Why I'm Opposed to the War in Vietnam. He said, I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. There is something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that would praise you when you say be nonviolent toward Sheriff Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. There is something wrong with that press, said Dr. Martin Luther King. When we flew into Memphis 2 days ago, we headed directly to the Lorraine Motel, where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, when he took his crusade against war and for the poor, putting them together in that dangerous combination, taking on the entire system and government of this country, where he talked about saying, I'm convinced if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. These are the quotes we don't often hear or see on the anniversaries of Dr. King's birthday and his assassination. Jeff Cohen has done a good job of putting together these quotes, and I encourage people to get Jeff's book and to read Dr. Martin Luther King's speeches. Try to get to the ones we don't see. We need a media that tells the truth, that expresses the reality on the ground. Danny Glover came out earlier tonight, a few years ago, when he took on the military tribunals and denounced them. He had been invited by the Modesto City Council to speak and be a part of a Dr. Martin Luther King birthday celebration, but was disinvited after condemning military tribunals. Danny Glover said then he wondered if Dr. Martin Luther King would be invited to his own birthday celebration. We are dealing with the gravest issues of not only our time, but of any time. Dealing with issues of war and peace, dealing with issues of torture, not talking about other governments doing this, but our own. How did we get to this point? I can say partially it is because we have a media that unfortunately in times of war acts as a conveyor belt for the lies of the government, and we need a media that is independent of the government. We need a media that tells the truth, that is not afraid. And I think that's what you are all about here today, the fact that thousands of people have come here to demand that media. The media are the most powerful institutions on earth, more powerful than any bomb, than any missile, and the Pentagon's deployed the media, and we have to take it back. Another woman who has something to teach the press of today is Mamie Till, who lost her son Emmett Till, who was killed in the summer of 1955 in Mississippi, lynched by a white mob. Not even clear today exactly what happened. They've just reopened an investigation into Emmett Till's death, 14-year-old boy who just went to Mississippi for the summer. But when his body was sent to Chicago, his mother engaged in a revolutionary act. She said she wanted his casket opened for the funeral. And thousands streamed by and saw the brutality of bigotry, saw the horrors of racism, the ravages of racism. And Jet Magazine and other black publications published those photos, and they were seared into the history and conscience of this country. Mamie Till, Emmett's mother, had something to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Do not sanitize. Don't obscure or hide the reality. I just have 1 minute. But last summer, when we saw the horror of Katrina, when we saw the devastation of this great American city, the corporate media actually did the right thing. They raced to New Orleans. And because the Bush administration did not respond, President Bush remaining on vacation in Crawford, Vice President Dick Cheney on vacation in Wyoming, Condoleezza Rice in New York taking in Spamalot, and then the Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, on vacation in New England, because they didn't respond, when the corporate media got there, there were no troops to embed with. And something incredible happened in their coverage of New Orleans. We saw a media that was unspun, unembedded, and it electrified this nation. Seeing the bodies floating by on our TV screens, seeing a young woman reporter interviewing a man who just walked up holding his boy in the water, saying his wife's hand had slipped out of his, and as she floated away, she said, "Take care of the children." He told the story, walked away with his boy, and the reporter started to cry. That is reporting from the victim's perspective. And the whole country responded. It didn't matter if you were a conservative Republican or a liberal or a Democrat, a progressive, a green, an independent. The differences washed away. It was humanity responding to humanity. Could you imagine if for just 1 week in Iraq, we saw the babies dead on the ground, we saw the women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs from Iraq to Lebanon, we saw the soldiers dead and dying, we saw just some of the casualties that the Lancet Medical Journal said something like 655,000 Iraqis have died since the invasion. We just saw some of these images for 1 week. Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. I'll just end by saying, I'll be outside, love to talk to people, be signing copies of Static, but the reason we called the book Static, which I wrote with my brother, journalist David Goodman, was because in this modern, digital, high-tech age with high-definition television and digital radio, all we get is ever more static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need is the media to give us the dictionary definition of static. And that is criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. We need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Democracy Now!